welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning for this UK Council of Graduate Education webinar. It's my great privilege to actually be the Vice Chair of the UKCGE, and I'm also the Director of the Queen Mary Academy at the Queen Mary University in London. And it's also my great pleasure to welcome our panellists, with whom we're going to be focusing on and discussing generative AI, ChatGPT, and the impact on postgraduate work. The idea for this webinar came from several sources, and it's inspired by conversation with Jorge Freire about getting different viewpoints, that we should really discuss this matter from many different viewpoints. So we will hear the personal viewpoints of our panelists, which is coming from a range of perspectives. We have with us today a Professor of Artificial Intelligence, a specialist in PGR and PGT skills development, a PhD student, and an international educational specialist. I will shortly ask them to introduce themselves, and following that introduction, each panelist will present their viewpoint on generative AI for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. And please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. The chat is being monitored, and also, just as you're aware, that this is being recorded as well. It's such an exciting current topic, and I know it's exciting for some and causes anxieties for others. So it's a real interesting matter to discuss. So first of all, I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So Professor Wilde, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, yes. Hi everybody. I'm Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Kent. I've worked on machine learning algorithms for 35 years. So I've worked on the algorithms that are underlaying or that are being used in ChatGPT and similar systems. I've also been Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at the University of Kent. And in that role, I was ultimately responsible for the graduate school at the university.
Thank you, Philippe. Elena, please could you introduce yourself?
Hello, good morning. I'm Elena Forasacco, and I'm a senior teaching fellow in the graduate school at Imperial. And within my role, I'm the director of the Research Communication Program for PhD students. So dealing with the communication of their research projects, from literature review, theses, presentations, and posters.
Thank you very much. And Sarah, please introduce yourself.
Hello everybody, I'm Sarah. I am doing PhD at Queen Mary University of London. My research topic is Bionics and AI, so it gives me a little bit of insight on how the ChatGPT works and how we could use it in different applications. And other than that, I have been working as a demonstrator, the teaching demonstrator, so I have been assessing PhD and undergrad and master's work, so I can see the applications over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And George?
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Jorge Freire. I am an educational specialist at Católica Lisbon School of Business and Economics, and my background is in digital learning, mainly learning design. I worked with Elena and Janet at Imperial Graduate School, and my focus here is around co-design projects, or working with staff and students in other professional services to develop a course, to develop digital capabilities, to develop materials, approaches, etc. So it's around a combination of collaboration and dealing with change, disruption, etc., and all things brought by technology and the impact it has on education.
Thank you very much. Well, it gives me great pleasure to now welcome Philippe de Wilde to present his viewpoint first. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Let me share my screen and hopefully share the right screen. Does that
Yes.
Yeah, does that look
Yes.
okay? Let me move
Yes.
to slideshow, which yeah, I think that's right. Okay, thanks. I'll use my 10 minutes to tell you a little bit about the algorithms that are behind ChatGPT and other systems, and then draw a few conclusions which I think are relevant for PhD students. But we'll hear more from Sarah as well about PhDs. I'm going to talk about a number of models. They're called large language models. And ChatGPT is one of them. BART is another one. And there is also Wuda, which is a Chinese system. I'll more about that in a minute. So as you've heard, I've worked in AI for a long time. One of the advantages of that is that I've seen a bit more than the current hype. Many people who currently work on AI have joined in the last 10 years, and all they have seen is the hype that we now see. Because of my experience, I've also seen, for example, and worked through what's called the AI winter of the 1990s. And at that time, there was a dominance of another type of AI system called expert systems. And for those of you who weren't around at that time or who weren't active in research, in the 1990s, there was as much hype about expert systems as there is currently about the large language models. So you have to be aware that AI is something cyclical. And there have been cycles, there have been ups and downs, there have been 2 or 3 ups, and we're currently in an upward trend, but there also have been down periods about AI, and I think it's important to realize that. And as I told you, I was DVC Research and Innovation. Now, these large language models are basically generated by 3 main players. On the one hand, there is Google. And Google's original system was called BERT, and then they also had Lambda, and their current system is BART, and they're working to develop this further, and Google now perceives an acute threat from Microsoft, because Microsoft is allied with OpenAI, which is a foundation, Elon Musk being one of the founders of that. So Microsoft has allied itself and also invested billions of dollars in OpenAI. And they have produced a suite of large language models, GPT-2 first, then GPT-3, this was incorporated in ChatGPT. There is also Bing Chat. Bing is the search engine of Microsoft. Bing Chat incorporates GPT-4, which is the latest model. There is also DALL-E, which is a system that generates images. For example, if you want a parrot painted in the style of Picasso, DALL-E will generate that for you. So these are the 2 players in the US. So there is the Google and Microsoft. And as I say, for the moment, Microsoft seems to have the lead, certainly with students, with ChatGPT, but Google, of course, is working hard and will certainly make sure they have an equivalent product, and that will be based on BART and probably be incorporated in Google search engine. There is a third player, however, we shouldn't forget, that is in China. And basically, it's Baidu, which is a large Chinese company. They are allied with what is called the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence. And they have produced several systems One is called Wudao, that was in my title slide. The other is called ErnieBot, and also they're developing further systems. The Chinese systems are as powerful as the systems by Google and Microsoft, and they're also explicitly designed to be bilingual, English, Chinese. They will incorporate some other languages, but there's a specific focus on establishing a kind of equivalence of English and Chinese via these large language models. So that's the landscape we are operating in. Basically, I especially wanted to mention the Chinese systems because we do have a lot of Chinese postgraduate students. So all these models are called large language models, and that is what I will use as the sort of word to describe them all, LLM, large language models. They typically need about 400,000 processors to run. So these processors, they're not in boxes like your laptop, they're on racks, but they're large systems, consume a lot of power. And they learn. I'll explain in a minute how they learn. And one such learning cycle is very, very expensive. It costs between $5 million and $35 million. Actually, a couple of days ago, they asked Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, they asked him how much the training had been for GPT-4, which is the latest model. And he said that it was more than $100 million for one update cycle. So it's extremely expensive to train and of course to run as well. You need hundreds of thousands of processors. And this is basically a game being played between the US and China for dominance of the world of large language models. In Europe and also in the UK, there is lots of talk about large language models, including us talking here today. But we have to be aware that we are users of these systems. We are not creators, and I regret that very much. That is just a repeat of what has happened with microelectronics 30 to 40 years ago. So this is one slide, I think, that gives you some background. So it's not just ChatGPT. There are 3 players that includes China, and these systems are very expensive to run. Now I have one single bit technical slide to explain how these systems work. They're neural networks, and so they're models of the brain, very rough models of the brain. They have lots of parameters, about 1 trillion, so it's 10 to the power 12. And they are trained on a corpus of words and also images for GPT-4 and DALL-E. Typically a corpus of about 1 trillion words. And what does that mean, 1 trillion words? Well, that's about 1 million Shakespeare. So Shakespeare wrote about 1 million words, so 1 trillion, you're talking about 1 million Shakespeares. And you can think that's a lot, but personally, I don't think that's a lot, because don't forget systems like GPT are looking at texts in about 100 different languages. Now, of course, they're looking at more texts in English than in other languages, but I think 1 trillion words in 100 different languages, that's actually not much. Of course, the number of words you're looking at, the volume of text you're looking at, determines the cost of the training of the system. The second thing you should know is that these systems learn to predict the next word from approximately 1,500 preceding words. So if you want to have good results, you should give long prompts, or you should really interact with these systems for a bit, so that you have given in a couple of 100 words. Just giving a prompt of 3 words or so, let's say paint a blue banana, that makes it very hard. So these systems are designed to pick up about 1,500 words and generate the appropriate next word. They can also deal with images. and they learn from user feedback. So part of the training mechanism involves actually human users, some of them in Africa, some of them poorly paid, who are actually looking at the output and giving feedback to the system whether the output is acceptable or fanciful or dangerous, etc. So that's an essential part of training large language models. And they also contain many heuristic rules, for example, to filter out offensive language, filter out anti-vax discourse for COVID, etc. So they predict words and images, there is user feedback, and there are heuristics. Now, finally here, a little bit technical, it's my only really technical sentence here. So they have as many parameters as training words, again, roughly speaking, because there are different systems and they're evolving. So you could think, why don't they just memorize everything they learn? Because they have the memory capacity. But that's the big trick in these machine learning systems, is there is something inbuilt that prevents them remembering strings of words verbatim. And it's very, very technical, and that's where the money is. Basically, if you can do that well, then you have a good system. And I call it randomness, but it's more subtle than that. But I think that is relevant, especially if you're looking at plagiarism. So these systems have inbuilt mechanisms that they don't plagiarize, except if for very short outputs, of course, then occasionally you can have plagiarism. And so these systems have been called stochastic parrots, and I think that's a good word. They parrot what they've seen, and they do that in a stochastic way. And I think that's what humans do as well. And this is from an article in Nature in January about basically the disappearance or the dilution of disruptive research. There is less and less disruptive research. More and more science papers are actually doing exactly what these large language models do, is they look at lots of sources and they basically repeat these sources with a bit of randomness, maybe a bit of originality added. But really, we live in a world where there is less and less disruptive science. And now we have these large language models, and they are not disruptive either. They are very safe the way they operate. As I say, no plagiarism and lots of heuristics to rule out anything that might upset the users. And so here's my final slide. So from what I see in what's inside these systems, I think what's relevant for PhD is you can certainly use these models for literature review. You can use them to correct grammar and semantics. They will be used in language centers, for example. In social sciences and humanities, I think you can use them throughout your work. Of course, it would be very sad if you ask them to write a whole PhD thesis, but they are tools and they're certainly usable, and they will be even more usable in the next couple of years. In science and engineering, don't forget the texts that these large language models are trained on is not just literature or Wikipedia, it's also computer programs. And that's relevant, computer programs in about 13 different computer languages. And that's relevant if you do PhD in science and engineering. You can ask them to write pieces of computer code for you. And of course, they do other things. You can use them as a sort of counselor and discuss questions about an awkward supervisor or problems with your family, or even problems with your finance. So I think there is a great future for these large language models, as long as we realize that they are tools. And so they are not mechanisms for disruptive research. They're not going to create another Einstein or another Marie Curie. They're tools, and I think very useful tools indeed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a really great description of the journey to where we are now with these large language models. Thank you very much. I'll now ask Elena to share her viewpoints from her position. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you, Janet. And I just wanted to follow up on the last slide from Philippe, because a couple of weeks ago, I was at a writing retreat with final year PhD students writing their thesis. And actually, a few of them, we introduced a discussion about ChatGPT, and a few of them are using ChatGPT to verify the style. So a bit as Philippe said, check if the style, the tone is good enough to be in a thesis, but not then as copy and paste into the thesis, just as a reference tool. And that was a first use from students, and Sarah, I know you will talk more about it. And but on the other hand, again, talking to students, they have tried it. They have tried the ChatGPT for their own literature review or introduction to thesis or to articles. But again, they said they found kind of limitations. So they are using the product of ChatGPT as a sort of prompt to write their own literature review and or introductions, like the general parts of thesis or articles, because they identified, as we know, a sort of, and as Philippe said about stochastic parrot, they lack, the results of ChatGPT lacks in personality. So they use ChatGPT to understand and to see what they need to write about, and then they adapt it to their own style. And I found that approach, I mean, how students are reacting now to ChatGPT, somehow unexpected, but it was interesting to see how they are applying their own critical thinking when using ChatGPT. So they are PhD students, so maybe they are already at a higher level of critique, but still they are probably better than me with that approach. And in connection to that, thinking about how as teachers / instructors we should approach ChatGPT. Here there is something, it might look like huge, but I think the main point at this time with ChatGPT, for example, is that, as Philippe said, okay, let's give the opportunity to students to use it. And what we have to do from our side is change evaluation and assessment. So, for example, I was reading in, I think last week, an article on the Italian newspapers, because in Italy is a huge thing. I mean, even my dad was talking about ChatGPT with me. And I think is still, we can, in Italy, nobody can use ChatGPT, like in New York State. So there was an interesting perspective of an important professor in physics. Apologies, I don't remember the name, but his idea about the change of the assessment to meet the ChatGPT requirements actually was to allow students to use ChatGPT for assignments, but then evaluate not the result of ChatGPT, but the question asked by students. So again, in connection of what Philippe said, create a good prompt, a good question for ChatGPT, and assess it, and not assess the answer. And another approach to, again, incorporate ChatGPT in our teaching and higher education life could be also to, taking the example of that professor in physics, is evaluate the process and not evaluate anymore the product. So check somehow, depending on subjects, check how students are learning and not what they will produce at the end. Because if we are able somehow to verify step by step what students learn, how students learn, if they follow that process properly, then the product will arrive. So maybe it will be also a way to change not only our assessment, but also our teaching strategy. Teach more how to apply a protocol to produce something good, and focus on taking care and checking that students actually understand and apply that protocol properly, rather than check only the final result. And I think we had, I think that's it from my side. Yeah.
Thank you, Elena. And that was great to hear about assess the process and not the product, and suggestions like that. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I didn't say at the beginning that Elena can only be with us for the first hour. So if you've got any questions for Elena, please put them in the chat and we'll try and ask them before Elena leaves. Thank you. I'd like to ask Sarah. So Sarah's our PhD student voice. So I'd like to hear from your perspective, Sarah. And I think you've got some slides, yes?
Yes, I do. Right. Are you able to see the slide?
Yes, we are able to see the slides, yes.
Perfect.
They're not in, oh yeah, there we are. Yeah, they are. Thank you. Yes.
So I think Professor Philippe was able to cover a lot of the background and the research that goes on to creating such platforms. I would just go directly to the impact on the postgraduate education. So the generative AI, as compared to the other AI models, it is able to mimic human creativity. The sentence that I or any other student would write, it would also be able to paraphrase these sentences, maybe give us better suggestions on how this could be more concise, that it could contain more information. So I would say that it does mimic human creativity. Although at times you would be able to see that, yes, it is a bit impersonal and you need to edit it. The good thing is you can provide your feedback and get an alternative output. So with your own data, with your own feedback, you're training the system as well, and then you're getting the output that you require for your own application. So let's go to ChatGPT. So how students are using it, you have to, when we talk about this, we have to consider the English-speaking population as well as the students who do not have English as their first language. So most of them, they are able to use the, for example, Chinese or Arabic versions of ChatGPT, they write their questions and they are able to get a very good output, whether it is writing an email, a proper literature review, or even a basic application for the visa. So they're able to get their output from the ChatGPT and they are able to use it. The good thing that I would say is that about this disruptive technology is that it hasn't been around for a very long time. So as students are learning how to use it, the instructors or the evaluators also have the time to see how they can cover the pros and cons. So students are using it to summarize and paraphrase text, write a proper literature review. You can also get a proper outline for how you are going to be writing a piece of text. Like, for example, if I have a literature review, I would have only the feedback of me, my feedback, my supervisor's feedback about what topics to include. But if I am to use a ChatGPT prompt for giving me an outline, it would cover many more topics that I would have thought that, okay, these are the ones that I missed, and maybe my examiners would have mentioned that, why haven't you covered these topics? So it is kind of a safeguarding technique to see that I've covered all my fronts. I can write academic emails as well. I've seen a lot of students use it to write very basic emails to their supervisors about asking for a holiday, about their research progress, even for generating the whole presentation for their research. Then you can also run spell and grammar checks. You have to think that, okay, like you would consider a non-English speaking PhD student, they would be using it for the spell check for the grammar. So normally they would use Grammarly, which was a very like a basic format of the AI natural language processing technique. But now they have a proper prompt that could run the whole spell and grammar checks. It could also make your sentences concise, make them easy to understand. And also when you're preparing for your Viva, the final Viva, it can generate the practice questions as well. So before I go for a group presentation, I would generate some questions that I would already be able to answer. I would predict that what questions can come up and how I'm going to be answering them. So this was one of the things that was not available. You can ask one or two of your colleagues to give you feedback on your presentation and maybe give you some practice questions. You can practice interview questions for the jobs. You can practice research questions for your conference, for your presentations. And you can also generate a whole presentation, a whole PowerPoint. So it can give you a proper outline. It can give you a proper format that could go with it. I think that this is a very important tool that could be used for improving the teaching, improving the research content that we present. So this is a student overview of how it is being used. Now, when we talk about evaluating the postgraduate research, we do know that ChatGPT is not able to recognize. Actually, ChatGPT doesn't plagiarize, so it won't be highlighted in software like Turnitin. I think that is one of the things that need to have a little bit of work done. Because a proper literature review, if you have like 2 or 3 iterations on ChatGPT, you can come up with a good tone of the literature review. Then you can add some impersonal, like a personal touch to it. So yes, that is one thing that I would say needs a little bit of work in terms of the software development and in terms of the change in the assessment techniques. Digital learning, I would say that whenever I have to understand a topic, not only me, most of the PhD students around me, normally we used to go for research papers, but now before going to the research papers, we would first ask ChatGPT, what are the things that we should be studying? What are the things that we should be looking into? It gives you a basic summary, and then you go to the research papers. So I can say that it improves the quality of research. It improves the quality of the content that we write. Research and development, for that, I would say that it is a very good tool. Normally, you would see that PhD students, we have a lot of text in our presentations. We write a lot, but mostly we are reading it out during the presentations. So that helps when you have an outline and you can get a presenter view, you can get a proper outline on how you're going to design your presentation. So it is a disruptive tool, and I think we need a bit of learning to get in the pace with the improvement. In terms of library support, I think it is an excellent tool. So rather than searching directly for the books, it could give us a proper reference, like these are the basic textbooks that you should refer to for this subject. These are the research papers, and these are the intensive education or intensive research textbooks. Other than that, as Philippe mentioned, yes, you can write a lot of code on using the ChatGPT, but I have seen that if you're writing a specialized code, because in PhD, most of it would be like for plotting graphs, for having some figures. Yes, this is the kind of code that you can generate using ChatGPT, but if I'm writing a whole program for moving the servo motors, for detection of the EMG signals, then yes, I can use some pointers, but I still have to develop the code on by my own. But it is very good to have an outline on how to write my code, how to write it in different platforms. Like, for example, I can write in MATLAB, I can write in Python, but I don't know how to write in C. So when I write my Python code, it is able to translate the whole thing for me in C, which I think is amazing, because I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I don't need to learn the whole language to write a piece of code. So yes, we need to, there is a lot of disruptive techniques that are coming into play. And in terms of evaluation, it would be great if we can develop some techniques to evaluate the process rather than the end result. So the pros and cons for the system that I have observed, I would say that yes, it does lack the impersonal touch. That is one thing for sure. Sometimes the facts are not correct. You have to make sure that you run a proper and thorough fact check. Because if the resources that it is searching from have wrong information, that would be translated into the piece of information that it generates. So it is good that we should be researching the tool and understanding its limitations and maybe starting the work from there. But one thing that we have to make sure is that the system is continuously improving. As many students and researchers and evaluators, they use it, it is learning how to write better, how to answer the different phrases in a different tone. And it also has a proper, a mode for, do you want your answers in a professional tone, or do you want your answers in an impersonal and within a very casual conversation? So it is learning, it is improving, and it's time that we kind of incorporate it into the whole curriculum rather than banning it out. Because if we ban it, I think that it would still be used. And it is like limiting yourself to not using a technology. Because after the PhD, I don't think that anybody would be able to limit that what tools can I use for generating a PowerPoint or not. So I think it is good for me to be using these tools for learning these tools and reducing the hours that I would normally spend on just searching the research papers. Just having a list is a bit easier for me. So yes, that's all for me.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving us such an insight into how students are actually using ChatGPT and its equivalents right now. So it was really, well, it opened my eyes to more uses than I was thinking of. So yeah, it was and you're seeing, you're with the students and so you're able to see that. So thank you so much for that very clear explanation from the student perspective. I'd like to now to invite George to give his book. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you very much to Sarah, Philippe, and Elena for such lovely presentations. and for sticking to time, which is intimidating because I think I was never able to respect a time limit in my life, but I will try. So today I'm coming in from a digital learning perspective, which Sarah already covered a bit, which was brilliant to see that student perspective here. And in terms of a digital learning perspective, I will try to approach it from the perspective of mainly how collaboration allows for dealing with this kind of change in postgraduate education, and some elements of disruption to practice, good and bad. So this is a student, and I will start by trying to define a bit what I mean when I say digital learning, because if we ask 50 people what digital means, we will get 50 different answers. And in digital learning, there's a sort of some element of complexity that I will try to kind of approach in regards to generative AI. So when I mention digital learning, I mean in one way, the digital university. So that is our main digital platforms, our contact time, our research into programs, our lecturer and supervisor and student roles inside this institution, are very formal, tangible part of the student digital learning experience. And that's the first level of digital learning. There's also a more abstract level here in terms of more of an ecosystem, how these platforms are used and applied, some of the policies that rule them, some of the ethical expectations like academic conduct, research, communication, copyright, IP, data protection, etc. So we're moving away from tangibility and we're moving into the intersection of our ecosystem with our behavior in one way, and that is also digital learning. And finally, and this is the most interesting for me, when I mention digital learning, I mean how postgraduate students actually live and learn and generate assessment with technology, obviously in connection to the first two levels, but also using a selection of their own tools, capabilities, and approaches. So that's one of the elements that is less well known by higher education and is in connection with these first two levels. So that's digital learning. And when we look at the impact of generative AI, we see that impact grows the further away we move from the formal aspects of digital learning in higher education, and the closer we get to real practice by students, which is interesting. What do we know about postgraduate learners? In terms of postgraduate taught, we know that there are over 3,000 master courses in the UK alone. It's been rising tremendously. We know the main areas of postgraduate education in distance learning. We also know the main players, the main universities that offer them. And what is interesting is that that rising number translates into the number of distance postgraduate learners. 15% of all postgraduate learners are distance learners. Only 2.5 are postgraduate research students. So the number of students, postgraduate students that have been studying only online, as in some form of distance learning, has been growing tremendously, which is really interesting and has some impacts that we'll see later on. In terms of blended learning, so anything that has an element of digital learning and is also campus-based, we know that, and this is from a UCISA survey, 81% of courses offer some kind of blended element. So that's the majority of courses, things like assignment submission, for example, or lecture capture recordings, or access to materials and reading lists, or some element of investigation. 81% of courses offer this element. And around 36% of blended courses offer what we tend to call active blended learning. So conversations, collaborations, discussions, investigations, practice, etc., are now happening online and digitally, which is really interesting. Over the last few years, we've also seen an increase in TEL staff and an increase in tool adoption. So there's more of everything, which is really, really interesting. In terms of postgraduate education, student digital capabilities, we have these wonderful JISC roles. Postgraduate education would be the intersection of the student profile, so kind of a master's level 7 student, and the researcher profile for postgraduate research students. And these things include information literacy, learning independently, etc., and a range of capabilities that these students should have and develop throughout their education. So we know this. We know what we would like our students to develop and use, and how we would like them to interact with the digital side of their postgraduate learning experience. How about staff? Well, EDUCAUSE did a pulse survey in February and one in April regarding adoption, and overall we have some really interesting numbers here. We have growing interest in adoption from staff. We have a great consciousness of change and the fact that change is coming. We also have quite a lot of worry from our academic and support staff in terms of the impact. We also have some responsibilities being assigned already, some kind of initial movement of governance and ownership of responsibilities of generative AI. So what is happening is that higher education is absorbing this change and trying to respond to it. There are some problems, of course, and this is one of the main problems that we feel when dealing with change, is that in terms of formal governance and ethical expectations and policies and how we agree and then start acting on a sort of a set of shared values, we're being very, very slow to respond to that. And then also there's a lack of ownership or shared ownership in terms of who is responsible for this and who drives this, coordinates, facilitates this, and how do we move forward. So that's definitely something to keep in mind when looking at this. So back to students again. How are students using kind of generative AI? Sarah shared some wonderful examples and some wonderful possibilities. But if you dig deep, you'll see two types of main questions being asked around this, not the kind of the creativity, how can we use this for efficiency, productivity, conversations, self-testing, etc. People are looking at what kind of skills students might need to use this effectively, ethically, but the focus of the conversation is around misconduct, it seems, these days. I mean, those are the questions that me in digital learning are being asked more often from staff and support and academic staff. Originality, plagiarism, what do we do, how do we respond, how do we check, etc. Kind of makes me think that that is the main focus of what is happening, and misconduct is a signifier of a great number of things that we'll try to have a look in a minute or so. What we know about misconduct, for example, in terms of contract cheating, is that it's really hard to pick up. It has a negative impact in what we do as a social organization, a social service, higher education. And we know that what we know is not enough, and there's a reason for that. In terms of impact, Sarah mentioned some of the impacts, Philippe as well, and Elena also brought these up. There's a wonderful term from digital transformation that is the burning platform. And with burning platforms, you have situations like companies like Kodak that didn't adapt to the digital and then they disappeared. So we are not in this kind of situation. We don't have to rush to change. There's a lot of energy at the moment, but we're not in a situation where we have to abandon our core values and our core approaches and our core changes. But on the other hand, we also will not have decades or generations like we did to get used to the internet and search engines, for example, and the impact that had on information literacy and knowledge production. We know that. So what's happening in the field, what I've been seeing is that people are trying to deal with the now and support teaching, learning, and assessment at scale. There's a tremendous effort to do that. consider things like Turnitin AI detection, adoption or not adopting Turnitin. Those are decisions and things that are happening. And people are also starting to look at the future in an organized way. So academic work models, assessment design, digital capabilities, etc. Why are we kind of in this situation where we have all this energy? Well, from a digital learning perspective and from a perspective of dealing with change and digital incorporation of skills, capabilities, approaches, policies, etc., we're in this situation because we're not very good at dealing with what we call predictable disruption. We're very good at analysis and ideation and discussion and coming up with ideas. We are terrible at synthesizing these ideas, putting them into policy and practice, and then acting on them. And that is something I think that we need to do a bit better. And as an example, this is from the Horizon report that is published every year. Here is the entry around AI for learning tools and practice. Underline, you will see the benefits of the tool and how that might impact on assessment tasks and writing. And this is more than a year old. And, you know, this is widely read and people discuss this. And over the past 3-4 months, we're kind of dealing with this change as if it was like completely unexpected and came out of the blue, and we're kind of scrambling for solutions. Now, luckily, we can start analyzing what is happening and what caused this. I think that is very interesting before we kind of decide what we want to do in practice and put resources down to it. And the statement there is that this is a problem of our doing, not because of what AI is and does, but because of a range of things. So we know that we're looking at how we can adopt this tool and use this tool and treat this tool and incorporate it into our teaching and learning and assessment. That's absolutely fine. We're taking a great interest in misconduct and how that affects assessment design. That's really great, but we're not discussing, in digital learning terms, at least, two main things: how we do asynchronous and independent learning, and how we build our assessment so that when students are in the absence of a teacher and those formal situations and levels of digital learning, they can incorporate this change in this use well, because we do not do this very well. We don't do asynchronous learning very well, and we don't do assessment preparation and structuring and connecting that with teaching and learning very well. We also don't do digital capability development very well, and that includes information literacy, research, ethical expectations very well in staff and students. And we have poor workload models, which are kind of very stretched in terms of dealing with the now, let alone with change. And also, there's a disbelief in this level here of asynchronous and independent learning and assessment preparation. I've heard many times from academic staff that that doesn't work, so we're not focusing on that. And that's something that we should start looking at a bit more closely. So there's that red line there of what we're looking at and discussing now, and some of the things that are hidden that we need to look at a bit more closely in digital learning terms, because those are the big things. And that's why ChatGPT caught like wildfire. It filled that gap of the things that we were not doing very well. Luckily, we have a range of very creative, innovating, motivated people. And I've asked colleagues from academic integrity, from academic development, librarianship, etc., what kind of questions I should ask here. And I received a deluge of wonderful questions, from a critical perspective of adoption to assessment design and assessment changes and supporting staff and dealing with these changes, into the challenges of evaluating the process, not the product, and assessing higher up the chain, skills and capability development, collaboration and the impact, inclusion, and a range of many other things, including what is the point of postgraduate education in the world of AI. And if you notice that all of these questions and these suggestions, everyone from this range of support service people mentioned what can we do? So that's the message here, is that you don't have to be alone to deal with this change. There's a a lot of well-trained, qualified, motivated people here that can bring in these skills that are essential. And that's the main message here that I'm kind of closing on. When a system of authority fades, another one replaces it, or we get some shared values. And that level of governance and ethics and expectations that we can focus on and supporting skills and changes, that's something that we can do so that we can reach some sort of informed mid to long-term change, and we kind of don't panic. Look at what we did with contract cheating, for example. There's no shortage of roadmaps to deal with that. And it's a challenge, and it's still a challenge, but there's a lot of people collaborating to addressing this. So in closing, in terms of impact, we know that impact in postgraduate education is diverse and mostly in postgraduate taught. It's greater in independent learning and assessment preparation. It's growing because postgraduate digital learning is growing, and that impact will have an impact in costs and resources and skills and risk and change. We know that change will continue to happen at speed. Staff and students will adopt generative AI for good and bad, let's be honest. Speed will keep gaining momentum. Roles and digital capabilities will need to be integrated. It's not a nice to have now. And we'll need to be a lot better at dealing with this change, mainly by collaboration and co-design of our approaches, of our skill development, of our ethics and governance, and then our application of everything that we agree on and on a way forward, so that we're not kind of caught offhand by these constant changes that have been happening around generative AI and a lot around the last, say, 3 to 4 years. It's been a huge amount of change very quickly. So that's me from the digital perspective, and also from the kind of the support services and ethics and disruption angles. It would be lovely to hear your questions, and I hope I didn't go too much over time.
Thank you very much, George. And it's very helpful to have that perspective of how it's changing the systems and process. And I like your perspective around the ethics and the ethical considerations.